Slasher films have evolved over the years from Psycho to Nightmare on Elm Street to Scream and then to Saw and reboots. A slasher film is a subgenre of horror that is much gorier and has a much simpler story than other horror films, and they are most known for their horror icons. A slasher film is a horror movie, but instead of a monster or ghost attacking the protagonist, it's a violent, most of the time silent killer. The term slasher was first used as an informal term for any horror movie that involved murder, but it later became its own subgenre of horror. Slasher films were inspired by Italian
Giallo.
giallo and some other movies such as Psycho, Peeping Tom, and others. Slashers are split into 5 different sections: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Modern Age, and Postmodern Age. The slasher genre has many tropes in it. One trope that is in many slashers in the 80s and 90s is that many characters die during or after sex, or when the characters split up. They also usually always follow the same basic formula. They all have the same characters except for the killers. The characters are mainly a cast of unlikable teenagers or college students. They usually fall in the same 5 categories: the stoner, the token character, the sexually active friend to the main protagonist, the high score college jock who is sometimes the boyfriend, and then the final girl. The final girl is basically the final survivor who is usually female but on very few occasions male that confronts the killer and kills them. The main cast usually changes except for the main protagonist from movie to movie, and the antagonist is usually a man, but on some occasions a woman, who is fueled by revenge about something that has happened to their past that is connected to the main character. The story of the movies also follow a very similar formula. They start with a starting kill that then transitions into the title screen, and then introduces the cast. After that, it introduces the killer, or if it's a sequel, it shows how the killer is brought back to life. Then the killer starts to pick off the cast one by one, and finally, when only the protagonist is left, they then kill the killer, and then it ends with the cliffhanger and or jump scare. The sequels. Here's an example. Think of any popular slasher franchise, and chances are that slasher franchise probably has at least 7 sequels. Even if the franchise was bad to begin with or just okay, it still gets tons of sequels. Hellraiser and Leprechaun are both examples of this. All the sequels usually always follow the same repetitive formula as the previous ones. Killers and not their good storytelling. Not every slasher film was like this, but most of the more popular ones were like this. People watch slashers because of killers like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, or Charles Lee Ray, and Michael Myers. The story of slashers in the early 90s became much more goofy, like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th with Jason X. At one point, people would get tired of the same thing, but with a slightly different cast, and this did happen in the late 80s and some of the early 90s. They began to sell less and less tickets. Not even giant slasher icons like Jason, Freddy, and Michael Myers were selling tickets anymore. This happened because of the repetitive storylines, unlikable cast, and many unnecessary sequels. It was like this until the early 90s, and in the mid 90s, the genre was revived. Sequels and slashers trying too hard to be funnier to appeal to younger audiences. Slashers were pulled out of this darkness by Wes Craven with movies such as Wes Craven's A New Nightmare, and more importantly, and responsible for the revival of slashers, Scream. Scream made a slasher that balanced comedy and horror better than earlier movies that attempted this. The movie was much more meta than previous movies because it made comments on the horror genre as a whole. They made jokes on the rules of slashers, like commenting on things like never go anywhere alone or have sex if you want to survive in a slasher. The movie wasn't just funny, it was also scary with like Make-A-Wish and Hellbent. These movies were very different to other slashers directed towards straight males with things like female nudity. African American filmmakers also began to make their own movies with the more African American cast in the early 2000s. Some examples are Killjoy, Holla If I Kill You, and Somebody Help Me. In 2004, it was very different to other slashers. Even though it was very different from other traditional slashers, it is still considered a slasher. The movie was much gorier than the others, and its main focus was traps and body horror. The story of Saw was also very confusing and basically flashbacks the movie, which made the movie sort of hard to follow. Despite of this, the first was a box office success and spawned 7 sequels. In the last few years, Hollywood has become a YouTuber and run out of original ideas, so they thought, let's just reboot the classic slashers, but we won't add anything new to make it better. The Friday reboot is an example of this, where it's just the original movie, but higher quality. Not even the special effects in some of the movies are better. In the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, they try to pay homage to the original, but the CGI ended up looking worse than the original, where Robert Englund pushed his face against latex. When the reboots do add something to the movie, it's sometimes worse than like when they made Freddy Krueger a child molester on top of being a man who murders children. Slashers have become much less popular and started transitioning to TV in recent years. Don't have many famous directors, but some famous directors that they do have are Wes Craven and Rob Zombie. Special effects in slashers can be great, but also really bad in the same movie, or just all bad in one. About some slashers, but none of them compare to the god tier movie that was the first movie to skip its own sequel, Thanksgiving. The end.